Again, I want to welcome you to this presentation, the title of which you can see on the screen. And you can also, during this presentation, we'll hear about light coming into the darkness through a variety of events. I want to say a word about the format. The first presentation, part one, was largely a narrated presentation. This presentation, part two, is very different in that it is mostly storytelling through interviews. That said, let's begin.
St. Peter was no longer a parish. Actually, now it was a church of convenience from 1969 through 1986. It served only a few people who lived and worked in the area. That period of time was referred to as the low point of one of the oldest North Carolina institutions. It was truly a 17-year dark age of St. Peter Catholic Church. The sanctuary was neglected for years. The walls were painted dull and dirty white with dark blue wainscoting and trim. It was wall-to-wall bright red shag carpeting, just imagine it. A baldacchino, a canopy with burgundy curtains covering the door to the sacristy. Stations of the cross were in molded plaster, painted in neon colors. Truly, this was representative of an era long ago with a dowdy look and musty smell, and it was actually ill-matched to the intended new spirit of St. Peter.
Around 1985, a new bishop was appointed in Charlotte, and for St. Peter, that was a beginning of light shining in the darkness. And that light was the arrival of the Jesuits.
Both Father John Hoy, the first pastor, and Father Jean McCreish, the associate, are deceased, but fortunately a much younger Jesuit, Father Tom Gaunt, was with them in the early days in the rectory and is with us today on tape from his office in Washington.
So my full-time work was the director of planning and research for the diocese. Bishop Donohue came in December of 1984, and one of the things he wanted to do was to begin a diocesan synod. So I was appointed to be responsible for promoting and directing the diocesan synod, which was a large process encompassing all the parishes of the diocese beginning in 1985. At the same time, Bishop Donohue had this idea about inviting religious communities to the different major cities in the diocese to kind of bring their particular gifts and charisms to those realities. And so the idea initially was he would be inviting the Jesuits to come to Charlotte. He invited the Franciscans to Winston-Salem. He invited the Marians to Greensboro. And I don't think we ever got all the way down the line to Asheville, but the idea was that Asheville would be included. And so in the four large cities of the diocese, there would be a different religious community to come and staff and kind of bring their own gifts and charisms, to a parish in that city. So that was the idea. So I was working with Bishop Donohue on that. And so being a Jesuit, I happened to be one of the ones then inquiring and in the conversation involved with the Maryland Province Jesuits in 1985. when the idea of St. Peter's came up in the proposal. So I had been living in Charlotte for a couple of years before Father Hoy and Father McCreesh came to St. Peter's in February of 1986.
What was it like coming here at the same time with Father Hoy and Father McCreesh? What was it like at the rectory when you were there together?
Well, we moved in, and we had to reconfigure the rectory. It had been kind of set up, for the previous pastor, and it was just a single individual there then. So we had to kind of figure out how we would live in there. But also St. Peter's had for a number of years been a parish of convenience, of ease. And so it was meant to serve people downtown for conventions and meetings, people at some of the hotels, but then to have a noontime mass. But there wasn't a lot of other activity at that time at St. Peter's. So we moved in, as the earliest parishioners will remember, in 1986, downtown Charlotte was empty by 5:30 in the evening. There was almost nothing. The restaurants, other activities, performances, they just weren't going on. Museums were not downtown. And so at 5:30 in the evening, quite literally, was the pastor at St. Peter's, and the homeless were the only people down there on South Tryon Street. So we came in, they had put in barbed wire around the rectory and the parking lot in the back because of break-ins and incidences there. And so one of the first things we did was simply to take down the barbed wire. There were 3 active, engaged Jesuits living here. And we did not quite have the concern, on the break-ins or on the safety. So the barbed wire came down, and I forget now, one of the parishioners had spoken about the garden out front. And that was just a kind of a sodded area in front of the old rectory. And it was proposed to put in a more formal garden and planting. And so the barbed wire came down, the fence came down to just a lower wrought iron fence and gate, and the garden was put up. And I think that was in the first spring. And there was a news story in the Charlotte Observer from one of the reporters that just wrote up, there's something new and different on South Tryon Street, and admiring the garden and how lovely it was to see it. And of course, the reporters from the Observer were almost across the street, so they would come by there and they'd see that often enough. But this was sort of the change of just kind of bringing life, and the parish itself kind of revitalized instead, of having a real base of people and parishioners, more than just providing mass on the weekends or at noontime. So it's just sort of bringing more people into the area at that point. So it was quite a difference just adjusting to it and trying to figure things out.
Tell us about how you felt in the midst of this.
Well, I found it very exciting. And again, with Father Hoy and Father McCreesh, I mean, they were the perfect pair at the start for St. Peter's, I think. And part of it, again, was very unintentional. If it had been Father Hoy and myself in residence, things would have been different. But Father McCreesh came in and gave a whole nother perspective in life. But in the city of Charlotte, it was a key moment because the big buildings were just starting. There were a lot more vacant lots and spaces around us at that time. And people were just starting to kind of engage more in the downtown section. So that was exciting. You had the booming of the downtown economy and kind of re-engaging the downtown urban life of Charlotte. You had with Father McCreesh and others the focus on the homelessness, the engagement with George Shin in building the homeless center, just above Trade and Tryon. So there was an expansion of attention, to the urban poor at the time, and the growth of the Catholic community. I mean, you just had thousands of new Catholics moving into the Charlotte area every month, really. So there was this vibrancy that was taking off in the area itself. So it was a very opportune time. And I think we had, with Father Hoy, engaging much more with the business community on that level and very successfully. And then with Father McCreesh, dealing very much in terms of the issues of homelessness and urban poverty and people in need. So it was a great pairing at the start of the.
Rather than redesigning the church interior itself, Father Hoy wanted parish members deciding what to do. He also wanted to reduce the reliance on outdated symbolism. All of this interior design was relatively easy to do. The big challenge is what to do with that blank wall. After a great deal of discussion, they agreed on a fresco, and they selected artist Ben Long to do it. Anne McKenna was not only Ben Long's agent, but a loyal St. Peter Parish member. With his business involvement, Father Hoy felt that the fresco would be an excellent PR vehicle, increasing the parish profile in the community. The parish was proud of its faith, but needed to have a thing to be proud of. And the fresco might be just that thing, and would be something for the entire community.
And this is the thing that Joe mentioned that brought pride to the parish, a Ben Long fresco. Now, we're showing this to you early in the presentation because we want to make some comments about its uniqueness, and because we want you to try to hold a picture of this complete fresco in your mind as we move through the presentation. There are some themes that we want to point out. You'll see in both the agony in the garden scene and in the resurrection scene, people asleep, okay? All of the apostles are asleep, oblivious to what Jesus is going through. The guards at the tomb are asleep, also oblivious, not really getting the importance of the moment. There is also a red drape. You can see that this red drape links the three parts of the triptych. In the first, the agony in the garden in the left, you can barely see the red drape near the upper left-hand corner of the sacristy door. And it drapes down a little bit into near the olive tree. The drape continues across the center, and it separates the risen Christ from those guarding the tomb. And then it continues into the third panel of the triptych, billowing in the wind of the Holy Spirit in the Pentecost scene. Then in the upper right-hand corner, you see it again, and it stands as a symbol of Pentecost. Now you're going to hear about this Renaissance from the people who were there. You're going to hear directly from the artist himself, Ben Long, and the major patron of the artist, Ben Long. Ben Long is a world-renowned fresco artist with frescoes all around North Carolina, in Rome, in the Abbey at Monte Cassino, and in Venice. Hugh McCall is the former president and CEO of Nations Bank that, through his vision, became Bank of America, the second largest bank in the United States at that time. For decades, he was a leader in the development of Uptown Charlotte and simultaneously a major patron of the arts.
What happened was a next door neighbor, Ida Wickham, Mrs. Charles Wickham, was selling paintings from her home, illegally, of course. And my wife saw a copy of a painting Ben Long had done of Charlie Wickham. And she wanted to give me a portrait of myself for my 40th birthday. Mm. And so that's how I know it was 1975 when I was 40. I met Ben and we had a hard time getting together, but we ended up that summer, I sat for the portrait in the mountains up in Blowing Rock. And that's where I met Ben Long. Now, come flash forward a few years, I don't know how many, I liked Ben immediately. He was a Marine, I was a Marine, went to the University of North Carolina, went to the University of North Carolina. So we hit it off immediately. And Ann McKenna was handling his paintings here in Charlotte, really. And so I began to buy some of Ben's paintings. And I'm pretty sure that Ann McKenna asked me to participate in this fresco, meaning give them some money. And so I remember doing that. Now, how much, I don't remember. Might have been as little as $25,000, but something like that. Anyway, I don't know what year that was. You all would know what year that was, but late 70s maybe?
That we started on this?
Yeah.
I think it was a little later than that, but
80s?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So I'd been,
because the Jesuits only got here in '86.
So I'd been buying Ben's paintings and had gotten to know him real well, and with Ann, and who incidentally was my advisor on art all my business career. And so I remember when they started on the fresco, and I started coming up here. My wife reminded me she used to come with me at night. We found it very entertaining to be with all the group of artists that were working on this. And each of them had their thing they did, like some people worked with the mortar, some, I think, and colorists we had. Laura Buxton was a colorist. She mixed the colors. And it led to a lifelong relationship with Roger Nelson, with Laura Buxton, and with Ben Long, and some of the others. I ended up literally being a patron of all of these artists that I met here, and I would come and sit and watch them work, and it was always interesting to me how the painstaking slowness of it all. I mean, how it came together, but it was we had a lot of fun. We drank a lot of wine. So I guess if it was okay. We decided it was a Catholic church, so it was okay. And so we drank a lot here, and we always left with a buzz, if I remember correctly. I know he did.
Now, you heard Hugh McCall talk about sitting for a portrait of himself that was going to be done by Ben Long. I mentioned earlier that Ben Long is a renowned fresco artist. He is equally as renowned as a portrait artist. And so we thought you might like to see close up some of the portraits that he did in the fresco. Now, here you see him at work, and you remember Hugh McCall talking about how painstaking the work is and how much he concentrated on his work. Now you can see, and you may not recall all of the portraits that are in the full fresco, but here's an example of one and another and another, and you can see these are truly portraits. And this is the finished portrait of the woman that you see him sketching in the photograph. Now, like the Renaissance artists that Ben Long is emulating, the self-portrait was a part of every work of art, every fresco that Renaissance artists did. Ben Long's self-portrait is in the top fragment on the left between the man on the left and the woman in the red head covering. Now, you've seen some pictures of Ben Long at work, and you saw what he looked like at the time that he was doing the fresco. He doesn't look like that in the self-portrait that he created. He paints himself not as a young man that he was at the time, but as how he perceived he might look as a man in his 50s. And that's also part of the tradition. It was a rare artist who painted his self-portrait as he was at the time. Okay, the almost never painted a self-portrait as if it were a photograph. Now also, this is from a very tiny piece of the fresco, and it can be seen on display in the narthex of the church.
All of that came from here. All of the relationships grew out of this little area right here.
Let me ask you more about your visits here. You really stayed in touch with this project. You'd come here with your wife, I think you said, and just watch him work and drink your wine.
We'd sit right there and watch.
What were you looking at? What fascinated you?
Well, we would look at everything. You know, there would be drawings.
Right.
There would be small drawing, then they'd blow it up to where it was actually was a model. Plaster on, and then after it was dried, watch them mark it up. They'd draw on it, and then they'd paint it. And so it was a lengthy process, and so we were constantly something going on. And Ben, of course, when he concentrates on his work, he really concentrates. He's not talking to you, and he's deeply into his work. So it takes a certain amount of interest to just watch somebody work that intensely.
Mm-hmm.
but it was different than what I was doing during the day, and I enjoyed it.
It was a very exciting time for me, and for Father Hoy was very. He was excited as well, and he just left it all up to me to find out what to do, and which is it's religion, so you've got a lot of room. So I actually I still preserved all the sketches, and I have to say that the first idea, it had 3 parts to it, which is, of course, the crucifixion was going to be part of it. And the risen Christ was, for me, it was the follow-up that should have been there. But Father Hoy had he was a Jesuit, number one. And next, he was very caught up about the Pentecost. And so because I had the idea of course, the Christ in the garden, which of course he liked that idea. But he didn't want he said something like, there's too much death, and the idea of having the crucifix, which for me is the absolute follow-up of the Christ in the garden, the crucifix, and then the risen Christ. That was my idea that I really fought for it, but he won that one anyway, so. And also the Pentecost was very difficult to do because there's a funny, pie slice to try to figure out what to do with it. The room itself would be hard to create it and make it somehow sympathetic to the risen Christ. So it was a tough idea. All the Christ figures were all made up.
Those were all made up.
Yeah, I couldn't find anybody to fill the role. So they all had to be, it made it a little more difficult to paint them. And of course, because of Father Hoy not getting made the third Christ, I would, I was relieved because it was tough. I mean, the Christ figure in the center, the resurrected Christ, that was pretty hard to do too. Because you had to, I had to, for me, I had to draw him quite a few times before I become I don't even think I was completely satisfied, but it got to be the best I could do. So that's how it happened.
Those of us who remember the fresco would often speculate about the face of Jesus in the resurrection scene. Are his eyes open? Are they closed? Is he looking at the ground? Is he looking at the soldiers? So now, for the first time, we're able to look into the face of Jesus. You heard Ben Long describe how difficult it was for him to paint the face of Christ. I don't know about you, but I think this is the most hauntingly beautiful rendition of Christ's face that I have ever seen.
Attracted you to his art, to his style?
Well, the richness of his colors. If you look at all of Ben's oils, are very thick, heavy, and rich is the only word I can think to speak of. If he uses layers and layers and layers, and then rubs off in another layer, and his work is just very good, fine. And I like his use of colors. Everybody sees colors differently, and so I liked his palette, if you will, and I've always liked his paintings because of that. Mm-hmm. And I've got quite a collection of his paintings.
How many do you think you got?
Hugh McCall never answers that question, by the way. A word about the photograph of the paints and the journal that you see in the upper part of the screen. The photographer documenting the creation of the fresco, Mark Studer, told the story of how he came to take this picture. As he was wandering around Ben Long's studio, he saw that his journal was open to notes, and in those notes was a drawing of the fresco. Between that, his glasses in the resting on the journal, and the paints, he said it was a photograph of happenstance, one that he could not resist. And one might consider that photograph a work of art in itself. Now, you also heard Hugh McCall talk about the painstaking work and attention to detail that Ben Long gave to his work. And we want to illustrate that with this slide. We all know about the mob in the background coming to seize Jesus. But have we ever really seen it? Now, if this screen were a full picture of the fresco, this would be the mob scene approximately to scale. But here's a close-up of that scene. And you can see in this very tiny piece, the attention to detail, the use of color to tell a story. And this is an enlargement of just the mob portion of that scene. And you can see, again, in something that is so small that there are faces and there are torches and there are spears. And it is telling the story in very specific detail and use of color, even in a scene that is as small as this one.
Or you've been a leader in bringing more art to Uptown. I wonder, having a fresco at this historic church uptown, was that part of your vision of?
Well, of course, I'm an Uptown person, and I probably would not have been interested in the church if it hadn't been Uptown, except that Ann was interested in it. So from my perspective, it was Ann McKenna that asked me to do that. And so I did it. put, as modestly as I know how to put it, I mean, every fresco in this town I put money into, including the law enforcement center. So, including the First Presbyterian Church, where I'm not a member either, and which I'm
Just uptown, though.
yeah, but it was really Ben, and I thought that his work was wonderful, and I wanted it to be everywhere.
Now, you heard Hugh McCall say at the end of that he wanted Ben Long's frescoes everywhere. This fresco I've included for a very special reason. It is from the dome of the Transamerica building, which is directly across Tryon Street from the Bank of America Corporate Center. And as I mentioned, it has a very special connection to St. Peter. In this enlargement of this fresco, if you look in the bottom center of the painting, you see a man in a green robe, and next to him, you see a man in a red robe with a green shirt. And on the other side of him, approximately the same size, to his left, you see a man in blue pants and shirtless. Between the two of them, you see a man in a black suit. And that man is Father Gene McCreish. He and Ben Long had a special relationship, and so Ben wanted to permanently honor him by including him in this fresco about Charlotte and North Carolina.
It would be a mecca for people to come to. Both it would become really a religious mecca in many ways. Yeah. And I thought it would. The churches and have kept the uptown alive in a different sort of way than most big cities. And I like having all the churches uptown, and they're sort of oases in the middle of all the commerce and infighting that goes on in commerce. And so I viewed it as an oasis that would attract people to our city and visitors. Mm-hmm. Art plays a huge role in doing two things, really: civilizing people on one hand, and causing the brain to work and to intellectually stimulate people to ideas and thoughts and what have you. And Ben Long was very good at that. Mm-hmm. Still is. Okay.
Their personalities suited one another, because at one point there was something about the fresco that Father Hoy didn't like it. He again was taking it up with Father McCreish and myself. And I looked at him and I said, well, what would you think if Ben Long told you to rewrite a chapter of your book? And he basically, well, that's stupid. And I said, and I think it's kind of stupid for you to tell him to redo his fresco. So he didn't quite appreciate it. He didn't think it was an apt analogy, but they were both kind of very artistic in each in their own way, in particular on it, and very talented.
Well, Ben and Father John had some conflicts along the way, you might say, and some really hard feelings. Long tried to reconcile their differences, his aesthetic and Hoy's liturgic. Long said that Father Hoy is a gentleman with a fine, sensitive intelligence. My visit with him in Paris at his studio rekindled my enthusiasm and sharpened my interest in his subject matter, so obviously holding a profound meaning beyond my expression. something I want so badly to understand. Father Jean McCreesh sent Blanc a card which said, "Ben, let's make something beautiful for Jesus." Blanc tucked that into his journal.
You also see on the screen a reference to Pope Julius II and Michelangelo. In the book, Wet Wall Tattoos, the author describes the often contentious relationship between John Hoy and Ben Long, and he then compares that relationship to the relationship between Pope Julius II and Michelangelo. And that is, Pope Julius II was the funder, as was John Hoy, and Michelangelo was the painter of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And Pope Julius had his view of what that should be like, and Michelangelo had his view of what that should be like. And it makes for a very interesting analogy. Ben Long didn't necessarily think it did, but in fact, it's a very well-researched and interesting analogy about Pope Julius II and Michelangelo. And then there was the dog. This story has taken on the stuff of urban legend. So let's hear the story.
Father Hoy did not like pets at all. And I think that he had something in the fresco. I forget whether the dog was there or not, but Father Hoy objected to this. There's no place for a dog, and on and on and on. And, you know, he was the one commissioning it, you know, signing the check. And Ben Long, you know, seemingly, as I understand it, sort of gave in for the moment. And then Father Hoy was off, I don't know, I think it was meetings in Rome or someplace, but he was going to be gone for like 2 weeks. And Ben Long went and put the dog in. And when Father Hoy got back, it was too late. You know, you'd have to chip out that whole side of the fresco and redo it. So the dog was there. Ben Long had the final word on it. But Father Hoy was apparently furious to find the dog back in the fresco.
Because I didn't think Father Hoy was serious. And it turned out he's really serious. He was very, he hates dogs. And I didn't know that. And I guess in this, when he was a little boy, he got probably frightened somehow. And he never, but he was kind of crotchety for a moment there. And then that made me a little bit mad too, because using the dog showed the fear that was also happening with the Pentecost, you know, that a sudden gust of wind and that kind of thing. It was a good, for me, it was a good idea to use it. But he was really angry about the fact that I had went ahead and put it in. But, you know, he should have known better that you can't just take it out suddenly and put something else in. You can't do it when you're doing a fresco. So I guess we had to settle down for about 2 days. I don't know, it was 2 weeks. It might have been that. But it was okay in the end.
So it was okay in the end, but there's no dog because the dog did not survive the fall of the fresco. So we thought we'd provide you with a sneak peek of some recommendations for dogs for Ben Long's next fresco. Meet Spanky and Yogi Pucci.
I really wish that it was still here.
Yeah.
And I think y'all asked Ben to consider doing it, repairing it, he wouldn't do it.
Right.
He's like that.
Where were you, or do you remember what your reaction when you heard that it had fallen?
Anger. Yes.
At
the people building the damn bank. In other words, it should have been held up, but it wasn't. I mean, somebody should have come in here. But the plaster is very delicate. If it breaks, it breaks.
Yeah.
And there's no question about that. Dynamite did it, and to pretend it didn't is a joke.
If the screen contained an entire picture of the fresco, this is what the fresco would look like today with the fragments placed approximately to scale. So you can see in the grand scheme of things, very little of the fresco has survived. Can't begin to explain how this works, okay? We could do a whole separate presentation just on the recovery process for the fresco. But you can look at the picture in the center, the small picture in the center, and you can see that the fresco was almost entirely destroyed when it fell. Now, you also see in the larger pictures these egg crate kinds of contraptions, I don't know what else to call them, that were invented by the owner of Historic Plaster Conservation Services. He had no idea whether or not it would work, but these structures took the fresco pieces off the wall. They were successfully rescued from the wall with little or no damage. And it was the first time in history that fresco pieces had been removed from a wall without damage. Father Joe Soborewski was the pastor during the time of the fresco falling and its recovery. There's a lot of irony in that because, as you know, all Jesuits have specialties, and Father Joe's specialty was art. He was an artist himself. He was an art historian. He was an art professor. And as an artist, he had a special sensitivity to what it meant to see the fresco fall, but some consolation in the recovery efforts under his watch.
So Father Joe recruited a committee to help with selection of an artist and the artistic theme. After reviews, John Collier of Plano, Texas, was awarded the assignment. John Collier is a renowned painter and sculptor. He created 4 sculptures for the Catholic Museum at Ground Zero. His works have appeared at the Smithsonian, the New York City Historical Society, Christie's Auction House, and several major publications, including the New York Times and the Atlantic. This is based upon John 21:15-19. I'll just read that. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to them, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me."
This is the artwork that replaced the fresco. This is also in the Renaissance tradition. It's what's currently in the church. It's traditionally known as an altarpiece. Historically, altarpieces were done in 3 separate panels that were then joined together. This altarpiece is symbolically separated into 3 panels by the arches that are on the top and the pillars that are on the side of the painting. Now, as you heard Joe talk about the discussion of the fresco and what that might be like, and if there was a committee to make decisions, there was also a committee. Father Joe established a committee to decide on what this kind of art should look like and what it should replace. So John Collier came to St. Peter with a proposal. And this was his original sketch. So just as Ben Long would do sketches first, John Collier, also a painter in the same tradition, would do sketches. This sketch, you can see, has most of the same elements of the final product, but with a number of differences. Fewer people. You might also note the Charlotte skyline in the background in the upper right quadrant of the sketch.
What draws you to spiritual and religious subjects in your work?
Yeah, I love the Lord, and artists want to do what they love. They want to paint and sculpt what they love. So even when I was working on secular projects for magazines in New York, very often, just to keep myself interested, they had a kind of subtext, religious subtext for me. I love that story about Peter and Jesus. So it evolved. As it evolved, it became a meditation, a visual meditation on forgiveness. If you look at the painting, it's the largest one I've ever done. You see, Jesus is standing on a rock, and the rock is on some gravel, and so it's also a meditation on Peter's name, the rock.
Right.
So Peter is on a rock too, but his rock has fallen off of the rock, Christ Jesus. Jesus says no other foundation can be built other than, or was it Paul that says that, other than the rock, Christ Jesus. Anyway, so Peter is reaching up toward Jesus, and Jesus is reaching down. He's going to pull Peter back up on top of his rock. If you see the rock Jesus is on, it's on some gravel. One place in Scripture it says, it's talking about Jesus. It says there is a rock not hewn by human hands, and if let's see, anyone who falls on that rock will be broken, but anyone the rock falls on will be ground to powder. And it's about that if we fall in repentance on Christ, we'll be broken, but we will survive. But anyone in judgment that the rock falls on at the end of time is in big trouble. So that's one reason for that. Peter is on a rock too, and he's reaching up toward Jesus. Jesus is holding a fishing line in his hand because he serves breakfast, which I think is an amazing story. He's already caught some fish apparently, and he's serving breakfast to the apostles who, as usual, have caught nothing all night long. Finally, he says, "Put your net on the other side of the boat," which they do, and it's of course a reminder to the apostles of what had happened long, back a few years earlier when they first met Jesus. You see other things you see in the painting. There's a young man in the back, slightly to Jesus's left. That's the Apostle John, and he's counting fish because in his gospel he says there are 140, I think, fish that they caught, which was completely amazed them. You'll see that there are different people of different time periods.
Right. I was going to ask you about that.
Different ethnic backgrounds. For instance, the young John counting fish is African American. There's an Hispanic man just to Jesus's right. I think they're getting some fish out of the boat, and an African American man with his back to us is in front of him. Then in the upper left corner is an Hispanic man, barefoot in jeans, and I think he's holding a fish.
He is, yeah.
Then there are two gray-haired guys in the lower left side reaching into the boat. That's me. I posed for those. And then the boat itself is an aluminum John boat, the kind that fishermen in North Carolina might recognize. It's, again, what I'm doing is actually quite traditional. If you look at Renaissance paintings of scripture subjects, you'll see that very often the people in the paintings are wearing Renaissance clothes. And I would imagine it could partly be because those are the clothes they had access to when they painted, but also because it gives an immediacy to the scene, so that we're not allowed to think this is something that happened. It did happen to particular people at a particular time long ago, but we're not allowed to think about that too readily, because the Jesus is here right now. He's not. We're repenting like Peter right now. All of those things are meant to jar us a bit. The people you ask in your questions who pose for these things. My neighbor Angelo posed for Jesus, and I was two gray-haired guys wearing a robe in the lower left. Peter was the foreman at the bronze foundry, where I often get my things cast. The man in the Hispanic man in the upper left is a welder at that foundry, and so is the Hispanic man to Jesus's right.
Now, John Collier talks about himself in the painting, and again, in the same tradition, there's a self-portrait in this painting that he did. We don't see his face, and we see him as two different people in old age. It may be because John Collier is both a painter and a sculptor. And those are his two major areas of artistic expression. And regarding the person who posed, was the model for Jesus, his neighbor Angelo, I've always felt all these years that there was kind of an Italian look to Jesus.
Yeah. If you look over to the right, you'll see an angel praising God underneath a thunderstorm. And this painting is, because it's about forgiveness, also has to do with baptism. When God in Noah's time destroyed the world by water, in baptism, God is using water to bring people back to himself. So with the angel, the scripture says there's more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than for 100 just men who don't need to repent. So that's an angel praising God, and there's a rainbow above the angel, again making reference to the rainbow that God puts after the flood, after Noah's flood, that God will use water to save humanity.
Now, we're showing you again the full painting. You heard John Collier say that it was the largest he's ever done. What he neglected to say was that this painting is done on aluminum, oil on aluminum, not a very common, quote, canvas for paintings, and hence the references, the several references to the foundry and to the workers in the foundry. The other thing is that he did not mention is that those arches are all one piece. They are not separate pieces, and they were lowered into place. They're notched under the bottom, and they were lowered into place over the rectangular, almost square aluminum canvas, and created the image of a triptych altarpiece.
Okay, so regarding the bas-reliefs, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
How were those subjects selected?
Well, if I remember right, the church didn't have a crucifix. So Father, again, this is very shadowy in my mind. I think Father wanted a crucifix. And so we decided that one of these pieces of art on each side of the main piece would serve that purpose. Then, because it is, I assume still is a Jesuit church, Saint Ignatius of Loyola was chosen. They just said, do something with Saint Ignatius. So I thought, well, I often like to put in my paintings or artwork people beneath the cross at Calvary that weren't actually there, because that's in the Eucharist and in our meditations, and we're often called to be there beneath the cross. So I put Ignatius down underneath the crucifix, praying. The man who posed for that was my father-in-law, B.F. Farrell, who's passed away now, and he was a mailman. And if you see his hands clasped, they're some of my favorite parts of the art in your church, or that man's hands look exactly like my father-in-law's hands. He had reached into and been cut in so many mailboxes that his hands have a very distinctive appearance. I can't remember who posed for the other figures. The homeless man, again, I was asked to come there, and I noticed homeless people that there was one man in particular that was in the sanctuary praying. So I asked about that, and they talked about their ministry to homeless people in the inner city. And so that made me think, well, maybe they would like to see themselves in the art of the church. So I included a homeless man there praying with St. Ignatius. And there's a plastic bag full of the homeless man's possessions below his feet. So these people in real life could never have been together. And at the cross, we wouldn't have seen any angels hovering over the Lord, but it helps to remind the viewer of the importance, the eternal significance of what's happening at the crucifix. And Jesus is saying about taking care of the homeless.
On the other side, I believe you have the Madonna and Child with African American features. Talk about the facial and overall body kind of reactions of the different figures.
Yes. Well, because St. Catherine Drexel was so important in the history of the church, I wanted to do something of her, because that's not the typical story of most parishes. They don't have that wonderful heritage. And at the time that she gave the pews for the church, I'm not sure what else she did, but she gave the pews, if I remember right. This was an African American parish, largely an inner city church. And this happened at a time when the church was very new. The African American people were having a very difficult time. Probably many of the people who went to that church had been formerly enslaved people, or at least very soon after the Civil War. At least they knew people who could remember these things. So Jesus said, as much as you've done it to the least of these, my brothers, you've done it to me. So these were people who had difficult times, who relied heavily on Jesus. And so I put Catherine Drexel praying to the Lord in his mother's arms, and I gave the Madonna and Child African features to remind the viewer of Jesus' saying that she had given this to Jesus, even though she had lived long after he died or rose again.
Did the
Oh,
inclusion,
Other
did-
things, I'm sorry, I forgot, I could add. Catherine Drexel wore glasses, but I didn't want to put them on her face so that you can see her glasses in the I think, at one time I had her glasses sitting on the ground near her, and there's a moth there too, because Catherine Drexel had been a well. And Jesus said, don't lay up treasure on earth where moth can eat and thieves break in. Lay it up in heaven. And so she's kneeling there and a moth is there listening to to her prayers.
Mhm. Did the inclusion or the decision to include Sister, I guess, Saint Catherine Drexel, was that a given when you entered this project, or did that come after some discussion? You remember the story about that?
I wish I could remember. Again, it's one of those things. Perhaps it's the skill of Father Joe who made me think it was my idea.
Now, a footnote to some of the things that John Collier said in this portion of the interview. When we were researching the history of the church for part one of these presentations, we came across no evidence at all that St. Peter at one time was largely and predominantly an African-American parish. He is correct in saying that there were African-American members of St. Peter because that's why Catherine Drexel gave the pews. African-Americans at the time needed to stand in the back of the church. They were not allowed to sit with the white members of the church. She gave the pews with the stipulation that African Americans would be able to sit during the liturgy. It was Jim Crow era, so it was still segregated, of course, but it was very different and progressive for the time. Also, what may have led to his conclusion about St. Peter was that, or is that, St. Peter's in Second Ward, and most of the Second Ward in the early to mid 20th century was a almost completely African-American neighborhood known as Brooklyn, and there would be Catholics who lived in that neighborhood who typically would come to church at St. Peter's.
There's a kind of joy, a spiritual joy of looking at a piece of art like I did for your church, which I don't have to think about it in story form. I just think about it as it communicates the love that I felt and feel and would like to do a better job of, because I sure don't do it very well most of the time. I want to express my love to the Lord. And so it helped making art about that. I get to do that all the time. I'm a court painter of the kingdom of heaven. It doesn't get more exalted than that, even though I don't do a very good job of it. And I am the least among the court painters of heaven when you look at the history of art. But it gives me some pride to think that I'm useful. It's a nativity. And you see there, St. Joseph is gathering firewood for a little fire to keep Mary and the baby Jesus warm. The tabernacle itself is shaped like a house. It has a roof, kind of like a house. The materials are lapis lazuli, and jade, which are semi-precious stones. They came all the way from Pakistan. I ordered them online, and then we had them applied to this structure, which made of the house. One of the thoughts I had, I can't remember if it's before or after my initial idea of the tabernacle was, Well, once a priest, I was at a conference, and the priest said, "Why did you put the nativity on the door of a tabernacle? It's making the tabernacle is a place of the Eucharist, which is making the crucifixion present." Well, you already had the crucifix, which I made to the right, but I told him that the Bethlehem and his birth make reference to the Eucharist right from the beginning, because the word Bethlehem means the house of bread. So you put the Eucharist in the form of bread, looks like bread, and store it there in the tabernacle. And Jesus is born, they put him in a food trough. So the tabernacle is, in some sense, the manger, because Jesus is placed there right from the beginning. There's reference to the Eucharistic nature of Jesus's mission.
Now, a couple of other things that he does not mention about the tabernacle. The door is a bas-relief cast in bronze. And while he described certain parts of the nativity scene, to give it a Carolina connection, if you look in the lower right quadrant from about the middle of Mary's left shoulder down towards her feet, you will see a Carolina rocker. She is sitting, holding the baby Jesus in a Carolina rocker. The other thing that he did not mention is that the tabernacle weighs 300 pounds, and it needed to be lowered into place with a crane.
Often the spiritual things that happen while I'm working on a project are not my art itself, but the things that happen. For instance, the frame around the central painting at your church, the gilding was done by my daughter, Kimberly. And Kim almost went in the hospital. She worked so hard for weeks and weeks to gild that piece. In fact, she vowed never to do another gilding project after your frame, because it was so difficult to do. But it was working with my daughter on something. We hadn't got to work together before. So that was important to me.
The next piece of artwork is by far the smallest in actual size, but quite special to the Jesuits and to St. Peter Church. The piece is a sculpture of St. Alberto Hutardo, a Chilean Jesuit priest, lawyer, social worker, and writer. As part of his ministry, St. Alberto founded his own organization for poor and abandoned young children. He also established a trade union and wrote extensively on the controversial labor movement in Chile. The artist, Chas Fagan, is nationally known for his portraits of all 45 presidents and Mother Teresa, among others. Remarkably, he's also a longtime member here at St. Peter. Tim Funk spoke with Chas recently in the church garden, standing by his wonderful sculpture. By the way, Tim does not have a mic on, so you'll hear his faint voice in the background.
And where can it be done? So I had some guidance there. So there was some limited guidance to where I could do things. And then beyond that, there was, as with all these things, you've got to have that creative beginning. And if we had determined it was going to be outside and not too grand, because that wouldn't fit with St. Alberto at all. So you had to do something that was more subtle And I was thinking naturalistic, stone. And then came that question, well, you can't quite start a sculpture without the stone. So where do you find the stone? So you kind of had to go backwards and start from another angle, which was seeking out the stone. And I happened to meet a guy who said, you know, there might be this discarded stone. That sounded good to me. And so I went over and looked, and sure enough, it's this beautiful stone, and it was flat-ish, which is also what I was looking for. Because if I wanted to mount a subtle bas relief, you'd want something that's relatively flat to accept the bronze. And then maybe even, you know, carve in some lettering that you might be able to decipher would be a good idea too. So a flat natural surface that comes flat, which is hard to find, and then some kind of a beautiful shape. And there it was. So, but in this case, I had the stone now. So I took an outline of that stone shape, and now I knew what my parameters were. Traced that onto a big melamine board, and then drew on that in pencil to get his likeness, and sealed that, and then put clay rod on top of the drawing just to give me a head start. With all figures, but especially religious subjects, every moment I'm in front of them, either painting or sculpting, I'm trying to relate to them and visualize them and see them in front of me. And so you always try to pull it out. It's, you know, no other way of saying it, but just trying to bring them to life a little bit, and trying to see that character in person. And so there's always a very you know, intimate thing about that. But with this one, there was more the mission, where he's got such a great message. In general, with every sculpture and public sculpture I do, I try to have a good story that people can learn. And in this case, the message was great. His personal story is great. And I thought this, you know, having it in a place where people might appreciate and understand it is ideal. So instead of just a stone figure high up on a plinth somewhere, or even in a niche on a wall, there's a place where you can actually come and meet this man. And maybe in the traditional sense that we all have with cathedrals, of meeting saints, you know, encountering them and trying to figure out why they were to be emulated. Well, now you've got one that right here, and it's more of an intimate setting, and it's understandable. Make sure that the message wasn't lost, because you know, people read quotes, but maybe they don't, and so that's why I actually sculpted a visible image of his quote. So the message of looking forward and taking care of your neighbor, no matter their condition, no matter what. Of him, it's that his message, you know. And I mean, and it's being able to see a pretty good one, and it's a serious Christ one. Embodied in everyone. So I wanted to be a little more on the defensive side. Gives you, and then I also wanted to be younger, because he was known for that message of activity. Everyone, you know, just getting things done, doer, no matter what type of thing. You know, I really wanted to convey. And so a younger image, there are not that many of them. There was one that I liked. It was a little 3/4, almost like this, younger. So I decided that was going to be the basis of what I do, and then I would just add all the details from all the others and age him a little bit.
So, well, it would be a mecca for people to come to. All of that came from here. All of the relationships grew out of this little area. All of that came from here. All of the relationships grew out of this little area.
Coming to the end, we're going to read a closing prayer and then quickly show you a couple of things, a couple of more slides before we finish.
There's a quotation from a Hindu poem hanging on the wall of St. Teresa's Place for the Dying in Calcutta, said Father Hoy. It says, "If I have 2 pieces of bread, I will give one to the poor and sell the other to buy a hyacinth. We all have a hunger for beauty. Good religious art evokes a sense of God. Our hope is that every person who comes into this church will be moved by what they see.
Good religious art makes a sense of God. Good religious art evokes a sense of God. A lot of our research was aided by the book, What Wall Tattoos, Ben Long and the Art of the Fresco by Richard Michel. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, you should contact the author at the email address listed on the screen, and I'll leave it up for a moment in case you want to copy down the email address. And now you see coming soon, coming September 23rd, to be specific, A History of St. Peter Catholic Church, Part 3, 35 Years of St. Peter, the Jesuit Parish in Charlotte's Center City. And as we finish, we want to thank all of the people that you see listed on the screen in alphabetical order, so that you know and appreciate the kind of undertaking and the number of people that need to involve in doing something like this. So on behalf of Joe Breen and myself, we thank you for being with us. We thank you for your participation and your attention, and remind you that this is a production of St. Peter Sages, and of which you are all a part. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone for attending our presentation this morning. This concludes the program.